The mechanic was elbow-deep in the engine of a broken-down cargo shuttle when the distress signal came through. It was faint, almost drowned out by the static of deep space, but it was there, a desperate cry for help. He froze, his wrench hovering mid-air, as the signal repeated itself. It wasn't from any human ship he recognized. The language was strange, filled with clicks and hums, but the urgency was clear. He wiped the grease off his hands and stared at the console. The signal was coming from a ship just outside the station's orbit. It was massive, unlike anything he'd ever seen, with sleek, organic curves that seemed to shimmer even in the darkness of space. But something was wrong. The ship was falling apart, its hull cracked and glowing with the heat of a dying core. The mechanic hesitated. He was just a repairman, not a hero. His job was to fix broken engines, not rescue alien ships. But something about the signal tugged at him. It wasn't just the desperation, it was the feeling that this was important, that if he didn't act, something terrible would happen. He grabbed his toolkit and ran to the docking bay. His small repair pod was no match for the alien ship's size, but it was all he had. As he approached, the ship's condition became even more apparent. Flames licked through the cracks in its hull, and debris floated around it like a halo of destruction. The mechanic's heart raced as he maneuvered his pod closer, searching for a way in. Finally, he found an airlock that was still functional. He docked his pod and stepped inside, the gravity shifting unnaturally as he entered. The air was thick with smoke, and the walls pulsed with a faint, eerie light. He moved cautiously, his toolkit in hand, ready for anything. That's when he heard them, voices. They were soft, almost musical, but filled with fear. He followed the sound, his boots clanging against the metal floor, until he reached a large chamber. Inside, he saw them, a group of alien women, their skin glowing faintly in the dim light. They were huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. One of them stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke in broken English. "Help us, please. Ship, dying." The mechanic's mind raced. He didn't know how to communicate with them, but he understood their fear. He nodded and got to work, scanning the ship's systems with his handheld device. The core was unstable, and the ship was minutes away from exploding. There was no time to fix it, they had to leave, now. He gestured for the women to follow him, but they hesitated. One of them pointed to a large, glowing object in the center of the room. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, pulsing with a strange energy. "We cannot leave without it," she said. The mechanic frowned. There was no time for this. But the look in her eyes told him this wasn't just an object, it was something vital, something worth dying for. He grabbed it, feeling its warmth through his gloves, and motioned for the women to hurry. As they made their way back to the airlock, the ship began to shake violently. Alarms blared, and the walls groaned under the strain. The mechanic pushed the women into his pod, his hands trembling as he fired up the engines. Just as they pulled away, the alien ship exploded in a blinding flash of light, sending shockwaves through space. The mechanic stared at the wreckage, his heart pounding. He had no idea what he'd just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear, this was only the beginning. The mechanic's pod shook violently as the shockwaves from the exploding ship hit them. He gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white, and steered the small craft away from the debris. The alien women huddled together in the cramped space, their glowing eyes wide with fear. One of them clutched the glowing artifact tightly, as if letting go would mean the end of everything. "We need to get to the station," the mechanic muttered, more to himself than to the women. He glanced at the fuel gauge and cursed under his breath. The pod wasn't built for long trips, and the station was still a good distance away. He'd have to work fast. As they drifted further from the wreckage, the mechanic turned to the women. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentle. They stared at him, their expressions unreadable. One of them, the one who had spoken earlier, shook her head. No hurt, but danger, follows, she said, her voice trembling. The mechanic frowned. Danger? What kind of danger? Before she could answer, the pod's radar beeped urgently. He turned to the screen and felt a chill run down his spine. A massive ship was approaching, a warship, by the looks of it. Its dark, jagged hull loomed ominously against the stars, and it was heading straight for them. That's not good, the mechanic whispered. He quickly adjusted their course, trying to stay out of the warship's line of sight. But it was no use. The warship was faster, and it was closing in fast. The alien women began to murmur among themselves, their voices filled with panic. The mechanic glanced at them, then back at the radar. He had to think fast. Hold on, he said, gripping the controls. He pushed the pod's engines to their limit, weaving through the debris field left by the explosion. The warship fired a warning shot, the blast narrowly missing them. The pod shook, and the mechanic's heart raced. He wasn't a pilot, he was a mechanic. But right now, he had to be both. As they neared the station, the mechanic activated the emergency beacon. This is Repair Pod Delta 7, requesting immediate assistance. I have survivors on board, and we're being pursued by an unidentified warship. The station's response was almost immediate. Delta 7, this is station control. We're tracking your signal. Prepare for docking. The mechanic let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But the relief was short-lived. The warship was still behind them, and it showed no signs of backing down. As the station's docking bay came into view, the mechanic turned to the alien women. When we dock, stay close to me. Don't let go of that thing, he said, pointing to the artifact. They nodded, their expressions serious. The pod shuddered as it entered the station's gravity field. The mechanic guided it into the docking bay, his hand steady despite the chaos. As soon as they landed, the bay doors closed behind them, sealing them inside. The mechanic slumped in his seat, exhausted but relieved. They were safe, for now. But as he looked at the alien women, he knew this was far from over. The warship was still out there, and whatever they were after, it was clearly important. The mechanic glanced at the artifact, its glow faint but steady. What is this thing? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The alien woman who had spoken earlier hesitated, then said, "It is our hope. Our future. If they take it, all is lost." The mechanic nodded, though he didn't fully understand. All he knew was that he had to protect these women and the artifact, no matter what. As they stepped out of the pod, the station's crew rushed to meet them. The mechanic held up a hand to stop them. "We need to secure the docking bay. That warship isn't going to just leave us alone." The crew exchanged worried glances but followed his orders. The mechanic turned to the alien women. "Come with me. We need to figure out what to do next." They followed him without hesitation, their trust in him growing with every step. But as they walked through the station's corridors, the mechanic couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The danger was far from over. The mechanic led the alien women through the station's narrow corridors, his mind racing. The station wasn't equipped for a battle, and the warship outside was a threat they couldn't ignore. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. "We need to get to the control room," he said, glancing over his shoulder at the women. They followed closely, their glowing eyes scanning the surroundings with a mix of curiosity and fear. The artifact, still clutched tightly by one of them, pulsed faintly, as if alive. As they reached the control room, the mechanic quickly accessed the station's systems. He pulled up the external cameras and cursed under his breath. The warship was still there, hovering just outside the station's defensive perimeter. It hadn't attacked yet, but it was only a matter of time. "What do they want?" the mechanic muttered, more to himself than to the women. The alien woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward. They want this, she said, holding up the artifact. It is powerful. Dangerous in their hands. The mechanic frowned. What does it do? She hesitated, then said, it holds knowledge. Power to destroy, or to save. They will use it for evil. Before the mechanic could respond, the station's alarms blared. The warship had moved closer, its weapons charging. The mechanic's hands flew over the controls, activating the station's defenses. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. We need to get out of here, he said, turning to the women. Is there somewhere safe we can go? The alien woman nodded. Our home, far away. But we need ship. The mechanic thought for a moment. The station had a few small ships, but none of them were equipped for a long journey. Still, it was their only option. All right, he said. Follow me. They hurried to the station's hangar, where a small transport ship was docked. The mechanic quickly began prepping the ship for launch, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The alien women watched in silence, their expressions tense. As the ship's engines roared to life, the mechanic glanced at the radar. The warship was closing in fast. Hold on, he said, gripping the controls. This is going to be rough. The ship shot out of the hangar, narrowly avoiding a blast from the warship's cannons. The mechanic maneuvered the ship through the debris field, using the wreckage from the alien ship as cover. The warship followed, its weapons firing relentlessly. The alien women clung to their seats, their eyes wide with fear. The mechanic's jaw was set, his focus entirely on the task at hand. He wasn't a pilot, but he knew ships, how they worked, how they moved. And right now, that knowledge was the only thing keeping them alive. As they broke free of the debris field, the mechanic pushed the ship's engines to their limit. The warship was still behind them, but they were gaining distance. We need to lose them, the mechanic said, glancing at the alien women. Is there anywhere nearby we can hide? The woman who had spoken earlier nodded. There is a planet. Not far. We can hide there. The mechanic quickly plotted a course for the planet, his hands steady despite the chaos. As they approached, the warship fired another blast, this one hitting the ship's shields. The impact shook the entire vessel, and the mechanic gritted his teeth. We're not going to make it if they keep this up, he muttered. The alien woman placed a hand on his arm. You must trust us. We can help. Before the mechanic could respond, she closed her eyes and began to hum softly. The artifact in her hands glowed brighter, and suddenly, the ship's systems came alive in a way the mechanic had never seen before. The engines roared with newfound power, and the shield strengthened, deflecting another blast from the warship. The mechanic stared at her in awe. What did you do? She opened her eyes and smiled faintly. The artifact, it is part of us. We can use it. The mechanic nodded, though he didn't fully understand. All he knew was that they had a chance now. As they entered the planet's atmosphere, the warship fell back, unable to follow without risking damage to its own systems. The mechanic guided the ship to a secluded area, landing it safely in a dense forest. For the first time since the chase began, he allowed himself to breathe. They were safe, for now. But as he looked at the alien women and the glowing artifact, he knew the danger was far from over. The warship would find them eventually, and when it did, they would have to be ready. The forest was dense and eerily quiet as the mechanic and the alien women stepped out of the ship. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and strange, alien plants that glowed faintly in the dim light. The mechanic kept his toolkit close, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. Where are we? He asked, turning to the alien women. The one who had spoken earlier stepped forward. This is a safe place. For now. But we must hide the artifact. The mechanic frowned. Hide it? Why? What's so important about this thing? She hesitated, then said, "It is a key to our past and our future. If they take it, they will destroy everything." The mechanic didn't fully understand, but he could see the fear in her eyes. He nodded. "All right. Let's find a place to hide it." They moved deeper into the forest, the alien women leading the way. The mechanic followed, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though he saw no signs of life. The planet was strange, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive stone structure, covered in vines and moss. The alien women approached it reverently, their glowing eyes filled with a mix of awe and sadness. "What is this place?" the mechanic asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is a temple," the woman said. "Built by our ancestors. Long ago." She placed the artifact on a pedestal in the center of the structure, and it began to glow brighter, illuminating the carvings on the walls. The mechanic stared in awe as the carvings came to life, telling a story of a great civilization that had once thrived but was destroyed by a powerful enemy. "This is our history," the woman said, her voice trembling. "We were once many. But they came and took everything. This artifact is all that remains." The mechanic felt a lump in his throat. He had never been one for emotions, but the pain in her voice was impossible to ignore. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You have helped us. More than you know. But the danger is not over." As if on cue, the ground beneath them began to shake. The mechanic stumbled, grabbing onto the stone structure for support. In the distance, he heard the unmistakable sound of engines. The warship had found them. "We need to move," he said, his voice urgent. But the alien woman shook her head. "No. We must protect the artifact. It is our duty." The mechanic hesitated. He wanted to argue, to tell her that staying here was suicide. But he could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to leave, no matter what. "All right," he said finally. "But we need a plan." He quickly began to assess the situation. The temple was sturdy, but it wouldn't hold up against the warship's weapons. They needed to buy time, to find a way to fight back. The mechanic turned to the alien women. "Can you use the artifact to do something? Like you did on the ship?" She nodded. "Yes. But it will take time." "Then do it," he said. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." The mechanic grabbed his toolkit and ran to the edge of the clearing, where he began to set up makeshift defenses. He used whatever he could find, rocks, vines, even parts of the ship, to create barriers and traps. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. As the warship descended, its shadow looming over the forest, the mechanic felt a surge of adrenaline. He wasn't a soldier, but he wasn't going to let these women down. Not now. The first wave of enemy troops landed, their weapons drawn. The mechanic took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The enemy troops advanced through the forest, their weapons glowing ominously in the dim light. The mechanic stood his ground, his makeshift defenses ready. He had set up traps using vines and rocks, and he hoped they would buy enough time for the alien women to do whatever they needed with the artifact. As the first group of soldiers approached, the mechanic triggered one of the traps. A large net made of vines snapped up from the ground, ensnaring 2 of the soldiers. The others hesitated, their confidence shaken. "That's right," the mechanic muttered under his breath. "Come and get me." He moved quickly, using the forest's terrain to his advantage. He threw rocks to distract the soldiers and led them into more traps. For a moment, it seemed like his plan might work. But the enemy was relentless. More troops landed, and soon the mechanic was outnumbered. He retreated to the temple, where the alien women were gathered around the artifact. Their eyes were closed, and they were humming softly, their voices blending into a haunting melody. The artifact glowed brighter with each passing second. "How much longer?" the mechanic asked, his voice urgent. The woman who had spoken earlier opened her eyes. "Soon. But we must not be interrupted." The mechanic nodded and turned back to the entrance of the temple. The enemy was closing in, and he knew he couldn't hold them off much longer. He gripped his wrench tightly, ready to fight to the last. Just as the first soldier entered the temple, one of the alien women suddenly stood up. She was younger than the others, her eyes filled with fear and desperation. She grabbed the artifact and ran toward the enemy. "Wait!" the mechanic shouted, but it was too late. The soldiers surrounded her, their weapons trained on her. She held up the artifact, her hands trembling. "Take it," she cried. "Just leave us alone." The mechanic stared in shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The other alien women looked equally stunned, their humming faltering. The leader of the enemy troops stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. "Smart move," he said, reaching for the artifact. But before he could take it, the young woman's expression changed. Her eyes hardened, and she clutched the artifact tightly. "No," she said firmly. "You will not have it." The artifact began to glow brighter, its light blinding. The enemy soldiers stumbled back, shielding their eyes. The mechanic felt a surge of energy in the air, and he realized what was happening. "She's going to destroy it," he shouted. The alien women rushed forward, their voices rising in a desperate plea. "Stop. You will die." But the young woman didn't listen. She closed her eyes and whispered something in her own language. The artifact's light intensified, and then, with a deafening explosion, it shattered. The blast knocked everyone off their feet. The mechanic hit the ground hard, his ears ringing. When he finally managed to sit up, he saw that the enemy soldiers were gone, vaporized by the explosion. The young woman lay on the ground, her body still and lifeless. The other alien women gathered around her, their faces filled with grief. The mechanic approached slowly, his heart heavy. "Why did she do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman who had spoken earlier looked up, tears streaming down her face. "She was afraid. But in the end, she chose to protect us. To protect everything." The mechanic nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He felt a deep respect for the young woman's sacrifice, but he also felt a sense of loss. The artifact was gone, and with it, their best chance of defeating the enemy. As the group mourned, the mechanic knew they couldn't stay here. The enemy would send more troops, and they needed to find a new plan. "We need to move," he said gently. "We can't let her sacrifice be in vain." The alien women nodded, their expressions filled with determination. They stood together, ready to face whatever came next. The forest was eerily silent after the explosion, the air thick with the scent of burnt earth and the lingering energy of the artifact's destruction. The mechanic and the alien women stood together, their grief palpable but their determination unshaken. "We can't stay here," the mechanic said, breaking the silence. "They'll send more troops. We need to find a way to fight back." The alien women nodded, their glowing eyes filled with resolve. The woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward. "There is one place. A hidden sanctuary. Our ancestors built it long ago. It may have what we need." The mechanic frowned. "What kind of sanctuary?" "A place of power," she said. "But it is dangerous. Only the bravest can enter." The mechanic didn't hesitate. "Then let's go. We don't have time to waste." They moved quickly through the forest, the alien women leading the way. The mechanic kept his toolkit close, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what they would find at this sanctuary, but he knew it was their only hope. As they walked, the woman who had spoken earlier explained more about their history. Our ancestors knew the enemy would return. They built the sanctuary to protect us. But it is guarded by trials. Only those who are worthy can pass. The mechanic nodded, though he didn't fully understand. All he knew was that they had to try. After hours of walking, they reached a massive cliff face. The woman placed her hand on the rock, and a hidden door slid open, revealing a dark passageway. The mechanic hesitated, but the alien women stepped inside without fear. The passageway led to a large chamber, filled with strange, glowing crystals and ancient machinery. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, similar to the one in the temple, but this one was intact. "This is the heart of the sanctuary," the woman said. "Here, we can awaken its power." The mechanic looked around, his eyes wide with awe. "What do we need to do?" The alien women gathered around the pedestal, their hands glowing as they touched it. The crystals in the room began to hum, their light growing brighter. The mechanic felt a surge of energy in the air, and he knew something big was about to happen. But before they could complete the ritual, the ground shook violently. The mechanic stumbled, grabbing onto the pedestal for support. In the distance, he heard the sound of engines. The enemy had found them. "They're here," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to hurry." The alien women nodded, their expressions tense. They began to chant, their voices blending into a powerful melody. The crystals glowed brighter, and the pedestal began to pulse with energy. The mechanic turned to the entrance of the chamber, his wrench in hand. He knew he had to hold off the enemy while the women completed the ritual. The first wave of soldiers entered the chamber, their weapons drawn. The mechanic charged at them, using his wrench to knock one of them to the ground. He moved quickly, using the chamber's machinery as cover. But the enemy was relentless. More soldiers poured in, and soon the mechanic was outnumbered. He fought bravely, but he knew he couldn't hold them off forever. Just as he was about to be overwhelmed, the chamber filled with a blinding light. The alien women's chanting reached a crescendo, and the pedestal erupted with energy. The enemy soldiers were thrown back, their weapons falling from their hands. The mechanic shielded his eyes, the light too intense to look at directly. When it finally faded, he saw that the enemy soldiers were gone, vaporized by the sanctuary's power. The alien women collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. The mechanic rushed to their side, his heart pounding. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman who had spoken earlier nodded weakly. "Yes. The sanctuary's power has been awakened. The enemy cannot harm us now." The mechanic let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. They had done it. They had won. But as he looked at the alien women, he knew their journey wasn't over. The enemy might be defeated, but there was still much to do. They had to rebuild, to honor the sacrifices that had been made. And the mechanic knew he would be there to help them, every step of the way. The sanctuary was quiet now, the hum of the crystals fading into a soft, soothing glow. The mechanic sat on the floor, catching his breath as the adrenaline from the battle slowly ebbed away. The alien women were gathered around the pedestal, their faces filled with a mix of exhaustion and relief. The woman who had spoken earlier approached him, her steps slow but steady. She knelt beside him, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. "You have done what no other could," she said softly. "You have saved us, and our future." The mechanic shook his head. "I just did what I had to do. Anyone would have done the same." She smiled faintly. "No. You are special. Your courage, your heart. These are rare things." The mechanic didn't know what to say. He had never thought of himself as special. He was just a mechanic, someone who fixed things. But the way she looked at him made him feel like he was more than that. "What happens now?" he asked, changing the subject. She gestured to the pedestal. "The sanctuary's power is now awake. It holds the knowledge of our ancestors. The enemy cannot take it. But we must protect it. And we need your help." The mechanic frowned. "My help? What can I do?" "You are one of us now," she said. "You have proven yourself. We offer you a place among us. To learn, to grow. To protect what we have, together." The mechanic stared at her, stunned. He had never expected anything like this. He had always been a loner, someone who kept to himself. But the idea of being part of something bigger, of having a purpose beyond fixing engines, was strangely appealing. I don't know," he said hesitantly. She placed a hand on his arm. "You do not have to decide, now. But know this, you are welcome. Always." The mechanic nodded, his mind racing. He looked around the sanctuary, at the glowing crystals and the ancient machinery. He thought about everything they had been through, the sacrifices that had been made. And he realized that he couldn't just walk away. "All right," he said finally. "I'll stay. For now." The woman smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "Thank you." As the days passed, the mechanic began to learn more about the alien women and their history. The sanctuary was filled with ancient technology, far more advanced than anything he had ever seen. The women taught him how to use it, and he quickly became an integral part of their efforts to rebuild. But the greatest reward came in the form of the knowledge he gained. The sanctuary's power wasn't just a weapon, it was a source of wisdom, a way to connect with the past and shape the future. The mechanic found himself fascinated by it, spending hours studying the crystals and the ancient texts. One day, as he was working on a piece of machinery, the woman who had spoken earlier approached him. "You have changed," she said, her voice filled with pride. The mechanic looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You are no longer just a mechanic," she said. "You are a guardian. A protector. And you have found your purpose." The mechanic thought about her words, and he realized she was right. He had always felt like something was missing in his life, but now he felt whole. He had found a place where he belonged, and he knew he would do whatever it took to protect it. The days turned into weeks, and the mechanic found himself settling into his new life with the alien women. The sanctuary had become a hub of activity, with everyone working together to rebuild and protect what they had. The mechanic's skills as a mechanic proved invaluable, and he quickly became a key part of their efforts. But it wasn't just about fixing machines. The mechanic had taken on a new role as a guardian, helping to train others in the use of the sanctuary's technology. He spent hours studying the ancient texts and crystals, learning everything he could about the alien women's history and culture. The woman who had spoken earlier, whose name he now knew as Lyra, was his guide and mentor. She taught him about their ancestors, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. The mechanic found himself deeply moved by their story, and he felt a growing sense of responsibility to help them succeed. One day, as they were working on a new defense system, Lyra turned to him. "You have come far," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You are not just a guardian. You are a leader." The mechanic shook his head. "I'm just doing what I can to help." Lyra smiled. "That is what makes you a leader. You do not seek power or glory. You simply do what is right." The mechanic didn't know what to say. He had never thought of himself as a leader, but he could see the respect in Lyra's eyes. It made him feel a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. As the weeks passed, the sanctuary began to thrive. The alien women worked together to create a new home, using the sanctuary's power to grow food, build shelters, and protect themselves from any remaining threats. The mechanic was at the center of it all, using his skills and knowledge to help them every step of the way. But it wasn't without challenges. The enemy, though defeated, was not completely gone. There were still pockets of resistance, and the mechanic and the alien women had to remain vigilant. One night, as they were discussing their next steps, Lyra turned to the mechanic. "We cannot stay hidden forever," she said. "We must show the galaxy that we are strong. That we will not be defeated." The mechanic nodded. "I agree. But we need to be smart about it. We can't just rush in." Lyra smiled. "That is why we need you. Your wisdom, your courage. They will guide us." The mechanic felt a surge of determination. He knew they had a long road ahead, but he also knew they could do it. Together, they were stronger than any enemy. As the days turned into months, the sanctuary became a beacon of hope. The alien women's civilization began to flourish, and the mechanic found himself at the heart of it all. He had found a new purpose, a new family, and a new home. But he also knew that their journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, battles to fight, and a future to build. And he was ready to face it all, one step at a time. The sanctuary had become a thriving community, a testament to the resilience and determination of the alien women and the mechanic. The once quiet forest was now alive with activity, filled with the sounds of laughter, work, and hope. The mechanic stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out at everything they had built. It had been a long journey, filled with danger, sacrifice, and moments of doubt. But now, as he watched the alien women and their children working together, he felt a deep sense of pride. They had faced the impossible and come out stronger on the other side. Lyra approached him, her glowing eyes filled with warmth. "You seem thoughtful," she said. The mechanic smiled. "Just reflecting on everything that's happened. It's hard to believe how far we've come." Lyra nodded. "It is, because of you. Your courage, your heart. They have changed everything." The mechanic shook his head. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. We did this together." Lyra placed a hand on his arm. "You are too modest. But perhaps that is part of what makes you special." The mechanic looked at her, his expression serious. "I've learned a lot from you. About courage, about sacrifice, about what it means to truly care for others. I used to think I was just a mechanic, someone who fixed things. But now, I see that I can be more. That we can all be more." Lyra smiled. "That is the greatest lesson of all. To see the potential in ourselves and others. To know that even in the darkest times, there is hope." The mechanic nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He thought about everything they had been through, the battles, the losses, the moments of triumph. And he realized that the greatest reward wasn't the sanctuary or the knowledge they had gained. It was the connections they had made, the bonds they had formed. As the sun set over the forest, casting a golden glow over the sanctuary, the mechanic felt a sense of peace. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew they could face them together. "Thank you," he said quietly, turning to Lyra. "For giving me a purpose. For showing me what it means to truly live." Lyra's eyes glistened with tears. "No, thank you, for showing us that even in the darkest times, there is light. You are our light." The mechanic smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He looked out at the sanctuary, at the people he had come to care for so deeply, and he knew he had found his place in the universe. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, the mechanic made a silent promise. He would protect this place, these people, and the hope they represented. Not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. And in that moment, he realized that the greatest reward of all was the chance to make a difference.